It hurts when I sit down. Black female prisoners of war were terrified of how American soldiers treated them. Kesha Williams pressed her hand against the cold metal wall of the ship's hold, trying to steady herself against the waves of pain radiating through her body. Around her, 28 other black women stood in terrified silence, waiting for what they believed to be their execution. They had been taught that capture by white soldiers meant torture, humiliation, and death. What they were about to discover would shatter everything they had been told about their enemies. Late November 1944, the transport ship USS cut through the grey waters of San Francisco Bay, carrying a cargo that would have seemed impossible just months before. Black women prisoners of war captured during fighting in the South Pacific. In the converted hold, Kesha sat among 24 women, her body aching from weeks of confinement on hard surfaces, her mind racing with images of the horrors she expected to face. She was 24 years old, though she felt decades older. Before the war consumed everything, she had worked as a civilian nurse at the segregated naval base's military hospital, caring for wounded black soldiers who fought for a country that barely recognized them as citizens. She treated fevers, assisted in surgeries, tended to gunshot wounds. Hard work, honest work. Then came the mission in the Pacific. The battle had been apocalyptic. For 3 weeks, her medical unit had faced constant bombardment while treating the wounded in impossible conditions. The military commanders had given their final instructions. Death before dishonor. Capture by the enemy would mean unspeakable torture. Kesha had seen comrades choose death. Nurses who preferred to detonate grenades rather than be captured. Soldiers who shot each other before enemy troops reached the medical bunker. She had tried to do the same. Wounded by shrapnel during a bombardment, she had crawled across the rocky terrain, determined to die with honor rather than face capture. But her body had failed her. She had passed out just meters from reaching a weapon. Instead, she woke to find a white soldier kneeling beside her. She closed her eyes and waited for the knife to her throat, the bullet to her head. But the soldier simply lifted her onto a stretcher and carried her to a field hospital. A doctor had cleaned and bandaged her wounds, offered her water, spoken to her in soft tones she couldn't understand. She refused the water, certain it was poisoned. That had been 5 months ago. Since then, she had been processed through a series of temporary facilities, always waiting for the torture to begin, always preparing for the promised horrors. But they never came. Instead, there were medical exams, adequate food, clean water. There was confusion and disbelief, but no violence. Now, as the ship approached the docks of San Francisco, Kesha felt a different kind of fear settling in. They were being taken into enemy territory. Surely here, away from the eyes of international observers, the mask would finally slip. The whole door opened with a metallic squeal. Kesha flinched, her body tensing. American soldiers descended the stairs, and she braced herself for the worst. But the soldiers were carrying boxes, not weapons. They began handing out blankets, thick woolen blankets that seemed impossibly clean and soft. A female soldier approached Kesha and placed a blanket around her shoulders. The woman smiled and said something in English, her tone gentle. Kesha stared at the blanket in her hands, unable to process what was happening. This had to be a trick, some kind of psychological torture designed to make the eventual cruelty even more devastating. Around her, the other women exchanged confused glances. They all shared the same haunted expression, the same terrible certainty about what awaited them. They were led off the ship in small groups. On deck, the cold November wind swept across the bay. Kesha's legs trembled as she walked, partly from fear and partly from weeks of inactivity and poor nutrition. The women were loaded onto buses with barred windows. As they drove through the streets of San Francisco, Kesha pressed her face against the glass, staring at a world that seemed impossibly prosperous. But there was something in the military nurse's gaze that intrigued her. It wasn't pity or contempt. It was something that seemed almost professional, as if she was seeing not an enemy prisoner, but simply a person in need of care. If you're enjoying this story of courage and unexpected discoveries, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what these women were about to discover about their enemies would challenge everything they thought they knew about war, humanity, and prejudice. They arrived at Angel Island in the middle of the bay, a former immigration station converted to process prisoners of war. As Kesha stepped off the bus, she noticed that the facility was divided into separate sections. The women were being kept separate from the male prisoners, housed in their own barracks with female guards. Processing began immediately. Each woman was photographed, fingerprinted, and given a prisoner number. Kesha became prisoner 4782. They were taken to a medical facility where American doctors and nurses were waiting. This was it, Kesha thought. This was where the torture would begin. Disguised as a medical examination. A doctor approached her, speaking through a Japanese-American translator. The translator was a young woman, probably in her early 20s, who introduced herself as Mary Chun. The doctor asked questions about Kesha's medical history, her injuries, her current symptoms. When Kesha mentioned the constant pain, particularly when sitting, the doctor's expression changed to one of professional concern. Through Mary, she explained that prolonged malnutrition and sitting on hard surfaces without adequate padding could cause significant tissue damage and inflammation. She needed treatment, proper bedding, and nutritious food to recover. Kesha waited for the trap to spring, for the kind words to turn to cruelty. Instead, the doctor simply began her examination, gentle and thorough, treating Kesha exactly as she would treat any patient. When the exam revealed signs of infection in Kesha's old shrapnel wounds, the doctor prescribed antibiotics and scheduled follow-up appointments. She gave Kesha a cushion to sit on and instructions to use it consistently until her body could heal. The women were assigned to barracks that seemed impossibly luxurious compared to what they had expected. Each prisoner had her own bunk with a real mattress, clean sheets, and blankets. There were showers with hot water, working toilets, windows that let in natural light. The barracks were heated against the November cold. That first night, Kesha lay in her bunk, unable to sleep, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Around her, the other women whispered nervously in the darkness. This had to be temporary, they agreed. This comfort was designed to make them let their guard down. The real horror would come later when they least expected it, but the horror never came. Instead, there was routine. Each morning they were woken at 6 a.m. They had 30 minutes to wash and dress before breakfast in the mess hall. The food was simple but plentiful. Rice, vegetables, fish, bread, fruit, more food than Kesha had seen in months. More food than many black civilians were getting back home, as the war tightened its grip on domestic resources. At first, many of the women refused to eat, still convinced that the food was poisoned or drugged. But hunger eventually overcame fear, and when no one died or became ill, the resistance crumbled. Kesha found herself eating with an appetite she hadn't felt since before the war. Her body, starved for so long, seemed to awaken with gratitude for each meal. After breakfast came work assignments. The 1929 Geneva Convention, which the United States had signed and actually followed, required that prisoners of war be given meaningful work, but not be exploited. The women were assigned to various tasks: sewing and mending uniforms, doing laundry, working in the facility's gardens, creating handicrafts that would be sold with the profits going to a prisoner welfare fund. Kesha was assigned to the medical facility, where her nursing training made her useful. She worked alongside the American medical staff, treating minor health problems among the prisoner population. It was strange, even surreal, to practice her profession again, to be entrusted with medical supplies and patient care. The American nurses treated her as a colleague, teaching her medical terminology in English, and showing her American medical techniques. She was even paid for her work. Not much, just a few cents a day, but it was real money she could use to buy small items at the camp canteen. Soap, stationery, pencils. The idea that prisoners would be paid for their work seemed absurd. It was yet another piece of evidence that contradicted everything she had been taught about American barbarism. In the afternoons, there were educational programs. English classes were offered, taught by volunteers from San Francisco. Kesha attended every session, hungry to understand the language of her captors, to decode the mystery of their unexpected humanity. She proved to be a quick learner, her nursing training having already given her some exposure to medical English. There were also recreational activities. A small library had been established with books donated by community organizations. There were musical instruments, art supplies, even a radio that played music in the evenings. On Sundays, a local pastor was allowed to visit and conduct services for those who wished to attend. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Everything Kesha had learned, everything she had believed about Americans, was being systematically dismantled by the simple reality of decent treatment. She had been told they were demons, monsters who reveled in cruelty. Instead, she found herself surrounded by people who seemed genuinely committed to following rules, maintaining standards, treating prisoners with basic human dignity. The female guards were particularly confusing. Most were members of the Army Women's Corps, professional soldiers who took their duties seriously. They were firm but fair, enforcing rules without cruelty, maintaining order without violence. One guard, Sergeant Patricia Morrison, took a particular interest in helping the women adjust. She was a tall woman from Iowa, probably in her 30s, with a determined demeanor that somehow managed to be reassuring rather than threatening. But there was something in Sergeant Morrison's gaze that intrigued Kesha. An understanding that went beyond military duty, as if she knew exactly what it meant to be judged by how you looked rather than who you really were. And it was this unexpected insight that began to plant the seeds of a disturbing question. Were her real enemies on the wrong side of this war? She learned basic Japanese phrases to better communicate with her charges. She organized cultural exchange activities, encouraging the Japanese women to teach traditional crafts, while the American team shared their own skills and interests. It was through one of these exchanges that Kesha began to truly connect with her captors as human beings. Sergeant Morrison had asked if any of the women knew origami, the traditional art of paper folding. One of the Japanese prisoners volunteered, but Kesha, who had learned the technique during her time working with Japanese immigrants at the military hospital, also offered to help. Soon, she found herself teaching a group of American soldiers how to fold paper birds, flowers, and boxes. As she worked, demonstrating the precise folds and creases, she found herself hesitantly speaking in broken English about her life before the war. The Americans listened with genuine interest, asking questions and sharing their own stories. A young soldier from California spoke about her Japanese American neighbors who had been sent to internment camps. The irony did not escape anyone. Japanese Americans imprisoned in their own country while Japanese nationals were held as prisoners of war. Both groups caught up in the machinery of fear and suspicion of war. This revelation about the Japanese American internment camps created another layer of complexity in Kesha's understanding. Americans weren't perfect. They were capable of injustice, of allowing fear to override principles. Yet, even in their imperfection, they maintained certain standards. The internment camps, as unjust as they were not death camps. Families were kept together. People were not systematically starved or worked to death. But there was something deeper going on in Kesha's mind. As she observed daily interactions, she began to make mental notes than written ones. Small details that contradicted everything she had been taught about white supremacy and American cruelty. The way white nurses treated her as an equal colleague in the infirmary. How her medical opinion was sought and respected. How she received the same pay as white prisoners for the same work. Kesha had grown up in the segregated South where black hospitals received fewer resources, where black nurses were treated as subordinates even when more qualified than their white colleagues. Here in a prison camp, she was experiencing a professional equality she had never had at home. The irony was devastating and revealing. During English classes, she absorbed not only the language, but cultural nuances she had never understood before. Translator Mary Chun became more than an interpreter. She became a bridge to understanding American contradictions. Mary explained the American concept of individual rights, the idea that every person possessed inherent dignity regardless of nationality or circumstances. That was why the Geneva Convention mattered to Americans, Mary explained. It wasn't just about following rules. It was about maintaining a moral standard even in the midst of the brutality of war. Americans wanted to believe they were the good guys. And treating prisoners decently was part of that self-image. It was a stark contrast to the philosophy Kesha knew from both Japanese propaganda and the American reality she had experienced. In the world she knew, surrender was the ultimate dishonor. Prisoners had forfeited their right to dignified treatment by choosing capture over death. But here was a completely different perspective. The idea that human dignity transcended political conflict, that rules mattered precisely when it was most difficult to follow them. As winter turned to spring in 1945, Kesha's physical health improved dramatically. The pain that had tormented her for months gradually disappeared, as proper nutrition and medical care allowed her body to heal. The pillow the doctor had given her became unnecessary, as her body rebuilt the tissue and muscle it had lost. She gained weight. Her skin regained its color. Her hair stopped falling out. She looked in the mirror one day and barely recognized the healthy woman staring back at her. But as her body healed, her mind wrestled with increasingly difficult questions. Letters from home, heavily censored but still informative, painted a picture of a homeland in final agony. American bombers were systematically destroying American cities. Millions of civilians were homeless, starving, dying. The war that American leaders had promised would bring glory and prosperity had brought only devastation. And there she was, safe and well-fed in an enemy prison camp, receiving better care than most American civilians were receiving in their own country. The guilt was overwhelming. She had survived when so many had died. She was comfortable while her compatriots suffered. She was beginning to see her captors as human beings even as they continued to rain destruction on her homeland. In March 1945, Kesha learned that Los Angeles had been bombed. The attack had killed about 100,000 people in a single night, more than either of the atomic bombs would later claim. Her family lived in Detroit, close enough to Los Angeles, that she feared for their safety. For weeks, she heard nothing with no way of knowing if they had survived. When a letter finally arrived in May, she cried with relief. Her parents and younger brother had survived, though their home had been destroyed. They were living in a shelter, struggling to find enough food to survive. Her mother's letter was carefully worded to get past the censors, but despair bled through every line. They were proud of her, the letter said. They hoped she was being treated well. They prayed for her safe return when the war ended. Kesha wrote back, trying to describe her situation without sounding like she had betrayed her country by accepting enemy kindness. How could she explain that she was eating 3 meals a day while they were starving? That she had access to medical care while American hospitals ran out of supplies? That her American captors treated her with more dignity than American military officials had shown their own civilians? It was during this difficult period that something fundamentally changed in Kesha's perspective. She began to systematically document her experiences, not only for her own understanding, but as testimony. Secretly, she kept a detailed diary of every interaction, every policy, every moment of humanity she witnessed. She collected small pieces of evidence, meal times, medical supply lists, photographs of living conditions. Mary Chun helped her understand that she was documenting something historically significant. You are witnessing something that contradicts everything both sides believe about war and race, Mary said during one of their conversations. That matters. Sergeant Morrison noticed the change in Kesha, her growing confidence and purpose. You're different, she commented one day. Stronger, like you found something important. Kesha smiled, thinking of the journal hidden under her mattress, the hundreds of pages of observations she was compiling. I think I found my voice, she replied. But as Kesha secretly documented evidence of unexpected humanity, she didn't know that her meticulous records would soon become the key to a revelation that would transform not only her own life, but potentially the way 2 enemy nations would view each other if she had enough courage to share her truth when the time came. In the summer of 1945, when the first news of atomic bombs reached the camp, Kesha knew the time had come. The war was ending, and with it, her unique opportunity to document a truth that could change history. Mary Chin found her in the infirmary garden, where Kesha was carefully typing her latest observations on a borrowed typewriter. Are you sure about this? Mary asked, looking at the hundreds of pages of meticulously organized documentation. I have to do this, Kesha replied, finishing her report. When we go home, no one will believe us. They'll say we are lying, that we've been brainwashed. But this, she tapped the stacks of documents. This is irrefutable proof. Kesha's plan was audacious. She had secretly photographed official documents, collected statements from other prisoners, recorded conversations with guards, documented every meal, every medical treatment, every moment of human dignity she had witnessed. More importantly, she had gotten several American guards, including Sergeant Morrison, to write official statements about prisoner treatment policies, starkly contrasting with the propaganda that both Americans and Japanese had been fed. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the administrative chaos of the transition gave her the perfect opportunity. While other prisoners passively prepared for repatriation, Kesha executed the final phase of her plan. She wasn't just documenting for history. She was creating a real weapon against prejudice and propaganda on both sides. Using her contacts with American journalists who had visited the camp, Kesha secretly organized a press conference on Angel Island itself. The date, September 15, 1945. Exactly 1 month after the Japanese surrender. The makeshift room was packed. Reporters from the San Francisco Chronicle, Los Angeles Times, and even correspondents from international news agencies squeezed in to hear what a Japanese prisoner of war had to say about her American treatment. But Kesha had prepared an even bigger surprise. "Gentlemen of the press," she began in surprisingly fluent English. "My name is Kesha Williams, military nurse, prisoner number 4782. For 10 months, I have systematically documented my treatment at the hands of my American captors." The silence in the room was deafening. None of the reporters had expected this. "I was taught that Americans were bloodthirsty demons who would torture and kill prisoners." Instead, she held up her voluminous dossier. "I found this." Page after page, she presented devastating evidence that completely destroyed the propaganda narrative on both sides. Photographs of clean and organized facilities, detailed medical records showing exemplary care, testimonials from guards about rigorous training in human rights. But the coup de grace came when she revealed something no one expected. "During my stay here, I have received better medical care, more adequate nutrition, and more dignified treatment than I ever received in my own country, as a black military nurse in the segregated U.S. Army." The bomb had exploded. American reporters looked at each other in shock. A Japanese prisoner of war was exposing not only the falseness of anti-American propaganda, but also the hypocrisy of racial treatment within the U.S. military itself. "You have treated a captured enemy with more dignity than you treat your own black citizens," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "That says something profound about the difference between official policies and unofficial prejudices." Charles Morrison, a colonel present at the hearing, tried to interrupt. "That is a serious and unfounded accusation." Kesha smiled calmly and pulled out another set of documents. "Colonel, here are letters from my family describing conditions at segregated American military bases. Here are medical records showing the treatment I received as a prisoner versus what I received as an American military nurse." The comparison was devastating. As an enemy prisoner, she had received individual rooms, 3 nutritious meals a day, immediate medical care, and wages for her work. As an American military nurse, she had faced overcrowded facilities, limited rations, inadequate medical equipment, and systematic discrimination. "The irony," she said, looking directly into the cameras, "is that I had to become a prisoner to be treated like a human being." Colonel Morrison tried one last card. "These allegations are clearly the result of enemy propaganda." That's when Sergeant Patricia Morrison entered the room. "Excuse me, sir," she said, walking up to the microphone. Sergeant Patricia Morrison, supervisor of the women's facility. "I can confirm every word of prisoner 4782's testimony." The colonel turned pale. "Sergeant, you're out of line." "No, sir. I'm following the correct line for the first time." She turned to the cameras. "For 10 months, I supervised the treatment of these women in accordance with the Geneva Convention. They received exemplary care, not because they were special, but because we followed our own principles." She paused carefully, choosing her next words. "And if we follow these principles with captured enemies, why can't we follow the same principles with our own black citizens?" The question echoed through the room like a gunshot. Kesha opened her last file. "I have here 47 signed statements from American guards, doctors, and administrators confirming that racial equality policies work perfectly when there's institutional will to implement them. You have proven that you can treat black people with dignity and respect when you want to. The question is, why do you choose not to do so at home? The impact was immediate and devastating. Newspapers across the country ran headlines about the prisoner who exposed American hypocrisy. The story spread internationally, forcing uncomfortable conversations about military racial segregation. But Kesha wasn't done. The following week, she organized a second press conference, this time broadcast on radio to Japan. In fluent Japanese, she systematically dismantled all the anti-American propaganda that had consumed her people. My fellow countrymen, her voice crossed the Pacific. We have been misled about our enemies. They are not demons. They are people with contradictions, capable of both great kindness and great injustice. But when they follow their own principles, they can be fairer to us than we are to each other. The radio waves carried her message to a devastated Japan, where millions of people heard a prisoner of war describing humane treatment in American camps, while they lived amid rubble and starvation. Kesha's final coup was not just to expose hypocrisy. It was to use that exposure to force both countries to confront their own contradictions. But what she didn't know was that her words were being heard in Washington by people with enough power to turn public embarrassment into real political change. And when she finally returned home, she would discover that she had planted the seeds of a revolution that no one, not even herself, could have imagined. When Kesha returned to the United States in 1946, she discovered that her press conferences had planted the seeds of a revolution that no one had expected. President Truman, embarrassed by the international exposure of American military hypocrisy, signed Executive Order 9981 in July 1948, officially desegregating the armed forces. The shame of treating an enemy prisoner better than our own black soldiers cannot continue, he declared in a national address, directly quoting Kesha's report. She became a special advisor for the implementation of the new military racial integration policies. Ironically, the woman who had been a prisoner was now training American officers on equality and human dignity. In 1950, she married Dr. James Patterson, a military doctor, who had been one of the first to read her reports. Together, they founded the Institute for Human Rights in Conflict, documenting the treatment of prisoners in wars around the world. Colonel Morrison, who had tried to silence her, was transferred to an administrative post with no prestige. Sergeant Patricia Morrison was promoted and became a pioneer in female military integration. Charles Morrison, the colonel who had mocked her allegations, never recovered professionally. He retired early, bitterly aware that a mere prisoner had destroyed his career with nothing but the truth. Mary Chun continued as a translator, but now worked for the State Department, helping to shape international human rights policies based on the principles Kesha had articulated. In 1963, during the March on Washington, Kesha was invited to speak about how human dignity transcends national and racial boundaries. I have learned that our real enemies are not other nations or races, she said. They are prejudice, ignorance, and the refusal to see humanity in one another. Her documents became part of the National Archives, studied by generations of historians, sociologists, and activists. The Kesha Williams documentation became the academic standard for exposing institutional hypocrisy. She lived to see the election of the first Black American president in 2008 at the age of 87. In a final interview, she reflected, "I proved that a single person, armed only with truth and courage, can force an entire nation to confront its contradictions." Kesha Williams died in 2010, surrounded by family and honored by two countries she had forced to be better. Her tombstone bears a simple inscription. She turned imprisonment into purpose, pain into power, injustice into change. The best revenge against prejudice and hypocrisy is not to retaliate with hatred. It is to expose the truth so clearly that it becomes impossible to ignore. Kesha proved that dignity maintained under extreme pressure can break chains of injustice that seemed unbreakable. If this story of courage and social transformation has inspired you, subscribe to the channel for more stories of people who have used truth as a weapon against injustice and changed the world one revelation at a time.